Hello everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Radiorama, where I show you, as the name implies, how to work on radios and other vintage electronics from the 1930s to about the 1960s. It's been a busy week here in the shop. I've got a lot of projects I've been working on for either other people or for the museum. Worked on this Zenith as well as this Philco last night. Just needed to do a little repair on them. They're out the door. Today we have a matching pair of Admiral clock radios, and I've worked on this model before. They're very basic. They are a 4-tube unit with an early PC board design. I believe, if I remember correctly, the board just goes right up against here and the tubes stick out that way. I don't know what their working condition is, so we'll go ahead and do exactly what you're not supposed to do and plug it in immediately. Which one did I plug in? Must be this one, because the clock hand is moving. So I'll turn it on. That's not the original knob. I'll need to find a replacement. The clock is quiet.
Fairfield on the 80 westbound between Airbase Parkway and Travis Boulevard.
That one works. So that's off to a good start. Let's try the other one. Alright. Whoops, maybe I didn't plug it in all the way. There we go. Now the second hand is moving. Will you work? They're both pretty grubby. Trying to decide whether or not I'm going to paint it, because it's kind of an unattractive looking non-color. Pretty amazing. They both work. Anyway, Admiral was kind of a budget brand back in the day. And, I mean, they weren't bad. They just were a little cheap. I'm trying to think of other cheap brands back then. Sylvania made a lot of cheap stuff. General Electric certainly made some cheap crap, too. So, I think between the two, I'm looking at one that doesn't have a salvageable case. This one doesn't really have a salvageable case. The bakelite is pretty badly damaged. This one, on the other hand, I think the bakelite would clean right up. I've got a lot of dirt in these areas here. Getting in there is going to be a nightmare. But let's go ahead and take this guy apart and see what's under the hood and see what we're up against. Probably not much. Well, it's already been recapped. In fact, I'm trying to remember. Did I recap this guy? I just don't freaking remember. I've worked on this model many times. They're very common. There's hardly anything here. There's 2 electrolytics and some ceramic caps. You start getting into this era and they've simplified the design down so much. There's just not a whole hell of a lot to go wrong. Since we're already ahead of the game and it's a hot day out there, I'm going to take this opportunity to take it apart, clean and scrub the chassis, or not the chassis, the cabinet, and then possibly paint it. This other one, like I said, I think the bakelite is salvageable. This is not. It's too scratched up and far gone. It's a pity, but, you know, I know some people are like, don't paint those radios, it's terrible! Well, sometimes it's the only thing you can do to make them presentable, and I do all of these to raise funds for the museum I'm a part of, so it helps. If it's more appealing to the average person to get one, then that's so much the better for us. And besides, this is not exactly what I'd call a collector's radio. It's very, very, very common, and it's not even in its day, it wasn't even that great of a radio. It's a 4-tube set, so it's only good for really local stations. Anyway, let's take it apart and clean the case. Okay, so I have prepped the radio. Basically, I spent about, I don't know, 5 minutes really scrubbing it out in the sink. And then what you want to do is go over the whole thing with rubbing alcohol. Make sure you get any grease, handprints, or anything off of it. This is a good surface. It's kind of dull now, so the paint will make a good adhesion. And what I'm doing is I've got this Krylon red spray paint sitting in some warm water. Every once in a while you want to shake it up a little bit. Spray paint will flow a whole lot more evenly and better when it's just a little bit warmed up. I mean, you don't want to get it hot, then you'll blow up the can, and that'd be a safety hazard. Anyway, anytime refrigerators or actually I haven't gotten any refrigerators. Anytime I get big boxes like these, I save them because they're great. If you're kind of a redneck guy like me and don't have a proper spray booth and you don't want to ruin your driveway, and since my whole yard is made out of rocks, if I get any paint in the yard, it's permanent, and that makes my wife angry. Actually doesn't care, but you get the idea. All right, it's time to get spraying. As noted by my windmills, they're all going that way, so that's why I always face it this way. Living on the coast like I do, the wind just blows the same direction 24 hours a day. All right, so what I'm gonna do is get my Krylon out here, and first I want to test spray it, make sure that it's spraying evenly. It is. The wind is actually a little erratic today, but I'll try my best. So what you do is just nice, even, sweeping coats. You don't want to stay in anywhere particular or hover, because then you'll get runs, and no one likes runs, especially the kind of runs that happens after having a big pot of beans the night before. All right. My wife rolls her eyes because she said, "You have the worst little boy humor ever." It's like I'm a 45-year-old man and act like an immature idiot. Whatever. Yeah, you just go around the whole thing, like so. And what you're looking for is evenness here. This takes a lot of practice. In fact, I'm thinking about upgrading to a spray booth and a spray gun. And by the way, do not do this in a confined space. And if you don't have wind blowing reliably in one direction to get the fumes away from you, wear a respirator. In fact, I probably should be doing that anyway. It's just that I wanted to show you fine folks how to do this. So you get the idea. I've got a lot more spraying to do. That's how you do it. Okay, so I'm done with the paint job. I like to use quite a bit because I've learned over the years that even though it'll look shiny initially, once the paint starts to dry, any textures that were in the bakelite or the plastic's going to show up. So it's best to put on a real heavy, thick coat, because what we're going to do when this is done is go over it with a buffer, and we want this finish to look like glass. It's already looking pretty glassy, but there's just a little bit of orange peel in there, and especially on the top where everyone can see like a pretty large surface. We want to make that look as perfect as possible. I'm not going to try to polish the stuff in the front. It's too detailed, and I'll just make it look worse. Besides, it looks pretty good. There's a lot of busyness and texture in that front, so if it's not perfectly flat, probably no one's going to notice it anyway. All right, welcome to day 2, working on the Admiral. And been sitting out here. It's a hot day today, and if you want your paint to cure, exposing it to good hot UV is a good way to get it to harden up. If you're wondering what that noise is, my dinosaur flag. My wife thought that'd be a good idea, since we also have dinosaurs in the yard, including our whatchamacallit, 8-foot tall Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's a real hit with the kids in the neighborhood. All right, so let's get back to the electronics, of which there's not much to speak of per se. We have the 4-tube chassis mounted on a PC board. Someone corrected me the other day. I said PCB board, and they were like, "It's not PCB board, it's PC board." I was like, okay. This form of manufacturing really revolutionized electronics when it came out. You no longer had to have direct point-to-point wiring. Instead, I believe these had some sort of mask, and you would just drop all the components in, and then there'd be a solder, kind of like solder river, that would flow everything in place and reject the mask. At least that's my understanding. The problem with it was especially some of the early boards would get affected by the heat from the tubes. Some of the earlier ones I've seen have the socket as part of the material. And what happens is that the heat would cause this material to become brittle or warp, and it could also cause the leads underneath to start to lift. This one doesn't look to be as near as bad as some of these others. I'll know when I start. Well, actually, since I don't have to recap it, I won't find out like how bad the leads are as far as lifting up. These seem to be pretty solid. Now, what I'm going to do next is install the oh-so-famous audio input feature. Usually I install it somewhere on the actual chassis. There's no room on this chassis, obviously, so it's going to be installed somewhere in the cabinet. So I'll install it loosely and run it through the volume pot here. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use the top and the bottom of the volume control. And you see how we have 3 legs here? There's one on either side and one in the center. Well, what we want to do is run the audio into the lead that the RF signal comes in, the radio signal. So I think it's either RF or IF. I get the two confused. There's internal frequency and radio frequency. But basically, layman's term, the leg where the radio signal comes in. And there are several ways you can determine which one is which. By default, if you find an easy way to determine which side is on the ground side of the chassis, then you know the other one is by default the incoming radio signal. And I'm looking here, and you can see at this lead here, that is the ground side. So that means that this right here, that is the incoming radio side. So what we want to do is make a little cut here in the lead, because what we want to do later is add a little wire with a switch on the end so that we can cut the radio signal off and on, so that when the user chooses to have their audio going through, that it won't be polluted by radio. And likewise, we want to be able to have the switch to turn the radio signal back on, so that if someone wants to listen to a ball game or whatever comes on AM radio these days, they can do so. And how we're going to do this is we're going to run our signal through one of these. This is an isolation transformer, and if I were to describe it electrically, all it is, it's essentially a glorified wall wart. People are always asking, where do I buy these? I get them off of Alibaba in bulk, and I get them in bulk because the more you get, the cheaper they are. I order 100 at a time, and they cost me a little less than $1 each. The museum pays for them. So I realize that most of the people watching here they're not restoring radios in massive quantities like I do. So if you do not want to order crap tons of these isolation transformers, you can just look around the house, and I'm sure, like most people like me, have a huge mass of wires and wall warts sitting in their desk drawer, the junk drawer, whatever. And if you get one, you can just crack it open, and the primary side will be where the 120 volts comes in, and then the secondary side is where your low voltage comes out, which is going to be, I don't know, anywhere from 6 to 12 volts. And so what we're going to do is run an audio signal through the secondary side of the transformer, and then the primary side will go to either side of the volume control. Makes sense? And we'll need to add a few other components along the way, because we also don't want to interrupt this set's automatic gain control feature. Even though I'm not sure if this actually has such a feature. It's a 4-tube set, so it's a little more basic. But we're going to add it just the same. We're going to add a series of a resistor and a capacitor, again, and actually I think I get series and parallel mixed up, basically in line with one another, to the top of the volume pot. And that will preserve the set's AGC and also prevent any sort of interference that this might cause while it's in the circuit. So I'll quit babbling and get out the content that I need and show you how it's done. Alright, so we're partially through the process. I tend to like to quote-unquote manufacture my isolation inputs before I install them. It's just easier. So we have our right and left channels coming together on one side through these pair of resistors, and then to preserve the AGC, we have, I know this is hard to see, there's a resistor half the value of the volume control, which in this case is 270K, and then we have a .02 rated cap in parallel with that. And so that will be in this. Then we'll have the incoming audio coming this way, and we're going to have it come through one of these holes, and we'll tie a knot in the cord to make sure you can't yank it out. And what I did is I cut a slit in the lead going to the volume control, and I've got my death wires connected. So hence the warning in the front of my videos, don't do what I'm doing, because it is dangerous. And we're going to go ahead and try it and make sure that we have no radio signal coming through. It's going to take just a minute to warm up. Okay, good. We've cleared, we've temporarily detached the radio signal from getting to the set. That's good. So now it's a matter of getting the set back in here, doing some reinstallation. I think what I want to do before that is maybe clean and polish some of the plastic parts, the knobs, that kind of thing, just to give the set a little bit more time out in the driveway to bake in the sun. And then I'll put this back together. I'm actually almost out of capacitors, so it's a good thing I didn't have to use caps on this one. I made an order today. By the way, if some of you guys in the US want capacitors at a good price and good service and help support a good guy, look up Sal's Capacitor Corner. Sal Brisbane, he's a, well, hope I said your name right, but anyway, good guy. I've had really good experiences with him. He's very professional, and I get all my caps from him. So again, big shout out to Sal's Capacitors and all of the stuff he sells. All right, so here is actually probably day 3 or 4 into the Admiral restoration. I say that because whatever brand of spray paint this is, it seems to take quite a long time to harden up. So it's been sitting in the sun for a few days. And so now that it is hardened up, I can reassemble it. I'm going to do it over this soft towel so that I won't do any damage to the paint, because even though it's hardened up, it's not totally cured. Spray paint realistically takes a couple of weeks to really cure. But it's easier to go ahead and put this kind of on its face maybe, so that I can install the speaker. The clock on the other hand is needing to go through the front. Everything was desoldered, so it'll get pushed back in that way. And then we will glue in the isolation transform and the audio input, and run a switch wire out the back for decoupling the radio signal. Before I put the clock back in, I am going to lubricate the movement. There's not much to these Telecron clock movements. They're very basic, but surprisingly they keep very good time. They essentially use 60 hertz that comes out of the wall and uses this electromagnetic field that goes around this drum, which turns a slow motor basically at 2 RPM, I believe. Maybe not even that. Maybe it's 1 point something RPM. Can't remember. Or 3 RPM. Maybe I'm full of shit. Let's see, what does it say? I can't see what it says, but no matter. I'm going to go in here and add just a little bit of oil. I'm using Zoom spout oil, which one of our more recent members insisted that I try out. And he is right. This stuff's real good. In fact, I used it on my old fan here. And that fan used to make a little bit of a racket, even though I oiled it with 3-in-1 oil. Now it's completely silent. So again, good suggestion there. So now we're going to put this back in, pull the wires through the front, and resolder them together. And I hate the way these things are daisy chained together. They're very fragile. It's easy to break the wires, so just be gentle when you're putting your innards back in. All right, you're not going to blow the walls off of the house. It's got a little speaker in it, but it is what it is. It is a little generic clock radio with a little 4.5-inch speaker. But anyway, it turned out pretty good. I haven't buffed out the paint job. I'll probably do that in a few days, and that'll get the finish just a little more perfect. But as is, it's not too bad. I'm going to let it sit here and play for half the day, and make sure that anything that could possibly burn out or get affected by heat It's going to happen when it's in the shop and not when it's out back in the wild again. Clock seems to be keeping perfect time. It's nice and quiet. Radio works pretty well. We've got the Bluetooth running through it right now. But I think this certainly made a big improvement with how it looked initially. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below and I'll try to get to them. But until next time that something comes across my workbench, see you guys next time. Adios.